How do you want to come in? Do you want to just come in with like the regular intro and then welcome back to another? Yeah, let's do that.
You mean just like full? How do we do it? Yeah, it was like a funny thing.
Let me ask you a quick question. What part of that didn't you understand?
I don't know what full means. You mean like full?
I didn't say full. I said just the regular intro. Hey friends, welcome back to another episode of your favorite podcast, That Would Be Rad. A podcast that majors in 80s and 90s nostalgia, comic culture, all things paranormal, and minors in retro video games, tabletop RPGs, pre-internet mysteries, and raising our kids to be half as cool as we were back in the 80s. We are your hosts, Woody Brown.
And Tyler Bentz. How's it going?
Dude, it's going good, but I think we've done it again, and here's what I mean by that. I think we picked a topic that ended up being way more, like we bit off way more than we could chew, and we didn't know that until we started chewing it.
Yeah, we typically, I don't even know how to say
Well, I just mean that as we started to, just like a lot of these things, as we started to kind of learn more about it, and, you know, it starts with one thing specifically, and listeners, you'll understand what I mean here in just a second, but one thing like piques our interest, we start diving into it, and then separately we end up going on multiple different rabbit trails, as Tyler likes to say, and we end up just kind of figuring out that, holy smokes, there's this whole like universe of information, and we could go in so many different directions.
I'm thinking that it is one of those other sort of topics that is, you can get pretty deep on, and there's a lot of sort of different examples. So let's just play it safe and say we're going to revisit it again.
Yeah,
in the future.
And I mean, if we're looking for reasons to bring up Dungeons and Dragons in an episode, I think the way we're kind of approaching this episode is kind of like a Dungeons and Dragons adventure in that there are kind of multiple or just endless possibilities where our conversation can go. So I'm excited to kind of get started.
But before we do that, speaking of Dungeons and Dragons, what are we doing tomorrow, pal?
I'm going to practice DM or being a dungeon master, and we're introducing one of our buddies who has never played Dungeons and Dragons,
Dan the cameraman,
to Dungeons and Dragons. And you know, I said this a long time ago, but I kind of had this interest in being the dungeon master because essentially their role is to kind of facilitate the story. And kind of, you know, deliver it to the players, and the players kind of are the ones that tell the story in a way because they're making the decisions that they make, and the story is kind of created around it. And so that's always been super interesting to me. And so I especially after playing with our dungeon master, Ellis, who literally is an encyclopedia of information, I realized quickly that
a lot of time.
It's intimidating. It's a lot of time. But still, I kind of want to practice it. So it's kind of going to work out cool because this guy's brand new, and I'm going to be in sort of a role that is brand new to me. And so we're just going to try it out. So I'm pretty excited about that.
Yeah, it's going to be awesome.
All right.
Let's get to it.
So as Tyler and I have been going over our endless list of topics that we have for season 2. We initially had a different idea for what we wanted to do for this week's episode, but I came across this article about this case, and it just sort of jumped out of the page at me. It was almost like just pure synchronicity that I basically just called Tyler and said, look, this is what I want to talk about this week. You kind of explore, but I've got to tell you about this case, but I'm going to do it on the podcast. So I told you this name, Tyler, when we first spoke, but there's this lady named Shanti Devi. It's one of the best cases of children's past life memories to ever be recorded in history. It was so like impactful at the time that it was even investigated by like this committee of really prominent people. You might have heard of one, Mahatma Gandhi. Now, let me give you a little bit of background on what this case is about and what happened and why this just piqued my interest on this topic today.
Okay.
So basically, back in January of 1902, a little girl was born to this guy named Chatterbooj Chabi and his wife, Jagti Devi. in this small town in India. And the child was given the name Lugdi. She grew up, had a normal childhood. She got married to this guy named Kedar Nath Chabi. Okay, he was an owner of a fabric shop. They tried to have children. The first one was unfortunately stillborn. And then on the 25th of September 1925, Lugdi gave birth to a healthy son by cesarean section at the government hospital there in Agra.
Okay.
And 9 days later, this poor lady died. This is on October 4th, okay? She died of complications. She was only 23 years old. 1 year and 10 months later, a little girl named Shanti Devi Mathur was born in Delhi, which is about 145 kilometers north of Mathura. So here's where it starts to get a little crazy. Now, Shanti Devi didn't really, do a lot of baby talk and babbling, and really was kind of like a quiet kid, all the way up until about age 4. That's when she kind of began to speak. But when she did, again, this is just the very beginning of how it starts to get interesting. When she started to speak in a dialect that was different from that of the family. Now, if you're listening to this and you're here in the United States, it is less like, but kind of similar to where, like, maybe if you grew up in the South and then you go up, not even to New York necessarily, although that accent would be certainly, recognizable or whatever. But like Boston, you know how we have all these different accents, right? It's more than that when you're talking about these foreign language dialects. Sometimes the dialects are so different that even words are different. You know?
I don't want to interrupt you, but the assistant coach for my daughter Amelia's soccer team, we've become good friends with him and his wife. They're both from India, and she was actually telling me that, you could go to like the next city over and it would be a completely different language.
Right.
Which
And the
is
same
pretty
is true
crazy.
for like Indonesia, where I used to live, China, all the,
But I'm not just talking about just dialectually. I'm talking about completely different language.
yeah, right.
Which is wild.
Exactly. And so this little girl started to speak this other dialect that, again, different than the family. And she started like kind of telling her parents a bunch of different, like what we know now to be memories. But she would describe like certain events like cleaning silverware and this town named Mathura and a picture of Krishna that she wanted back. And even, now again, this is 4 years old, and even of having a husband. She was given like a sari, and she told her mom, like, look, the merchant that sold you this completely lied about the quality. And then she said, like, I know because my husband owned a fabric store. She also surprised this like physician that, of course, like, okay, now you, Tyler, as a dad, you know that like if your 4-year-old or heck, even 8-year-old came up to you and was like, so I used to be married and, la da 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 da. You'd be like, whoop, time to go to the doctor.
Oh, yeah.
Right? So that's what these folks did too. They took her to the doctor. This little girl described in insane detail the cesarean section she had whenever she was, quote, pregnant with this son that she had. She would talk to the doctor and say, like, this isn't my real family. My family's in this other town. She'd never been to this other town.
Yeah.
And like all of this stuff as a little kid started just piling up. She would just describe these memories from her past life, essentially, that there's almost no way of her knowing, like just insane details. So essentially, what we're kind of talking about today is reincarnation, past lives. Tyler and I will talk about like what our thoughts are about it all. But this was the case that kind of made me think like, look, we got to talk about this because it's just fascinating. There's a lot of these that I came across, and I think it's easier now for us to kind of hear about or think about reincarnation. But rewinding the clock, not that long ago to the 1930s, this was really kind of the biggest case. It certainly made the news. It wasn't really a topic that was just talked about constantly, even in India. So going back to it, she began to even describe the way that her husband from her previous life looked like. I mean, down to really just kind of like 3 distinctive features, other than, of course, him owning a clothing...
Fabric shop.
Yeah, fabric shop. She said that he was like kind of fair-skinned, had this big wart on his left cheek, and constantly wore his reading glasses. And she also kind of mentioned that her husband, like the location of her husband's shop, she would talk about like what kinds of dresses she would wear, all this detail. Now, around this time, she's now 6. And again, her parents are just getting kind of like, hey, it was kind of cute before. The doctor said nothing was wrong with you. But boy, this is getting pretty intense, because at that time, she started even talking about having this stillbirth and what that...
I mean,
go ahead.
For the age of 6...
That is...
That is not something that typically comes out of the mouth of babies.
Yeah, right. It's not DuckTales, So this is when, like, her parents start to really kind of believe, like, hey, look, maybe she is having some sort of memory of this past life. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, the one sort of positive about this is typically most Hindus do believe. I'm presuming that she was, a follower of Hinduism. Typically, that is what they believe in, the circle. You're born, you live, you die. You're born, you live, you die. So I'm sure a little bit of that was easier to swallow, probably.
Oh, for sure.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's interesting too, because she never really mentioned her husband's name at this point, not until around the age of 9. Now, an important side note here is it is customary in India at the time, especially, that wives don't utter the name of their husbands. Even when specifically asked, she would kind of like blush and say that she would recognize him if she was taken to the old address, but she would not say his name. Finally, they end up arranging this meeting with this guy, and he kind of initially, he came with another family member and kind of posed as if he was the brother of the supposed husband, but she recognized him immediately and would give, again, details that only his previous wife would have known, from how the meals were prepared, what her favorite foods were, even especially later, because at this point she's a little bit older, and so this isn't inappropriate, but she would even give like the specific details about their like sex life.
Whoa.
When they finally met, she was like overwhelmed with emotion, obviously, and got to meet the son that, again, I'm saying all these things with the kind of filter on that, but it was her past life, right? So she's now met her husband from the previous life, who also brought his son, who basically she died after giving birth to only a few days afterward, right? And so she's now meeting this son. And so she has this like huge emotional experience. Word got around all through the country, of course. And that's how Gandhi heard about it, talked to her, went and visited with her. And he appointed like a committee of like 15 prominent people, everything from like people from parliament, national leaders, members of the media, to study this case.
Was her story sort of met with like ridicule or sort of like, wow, here's sort of proof of one of the tenets of our religion kind of thing?
It never really talks about how that relates to Hinduism, other than, again, she never did marry, because essentially it is a Hindu custom that requires widows not to remarry. Now, because of my limited knowledge of the Hindu faith, I don't know if that's changed in any way, if that's still observed or what. But, she, there's been several books that were written, several really kind of, famous reincarnation researchers and past life researchers and stuff went and interviewed her. And there is this guy who is, we would not be able to kind of talk about this at all without mentioning a guy named Dr. Ian Stevenson. This is the beginning of when I started going down a different sort of rabbit trail here.
Yeah,
because
I think he's in mine too.
this case was super, super interesting. Again, she was asked ad nauseum all these different points, right, to verify facts and all these things that she wouldn't have known but did. And so throughout, there have been, of course, critics. There have been a lot of people that basically say it's just a hoax. But just real quick, man, that's a heck of a hoax to come up with at 4.
Yeah.
And I don't know how you do, you know? And so that's really kind of what interested me in this just broad topic of reincarnation, past lives, and kind of diving into that and seeing where our conversation goes. So I encourage anybody to kind of look her story up. Again, her name is Shanti Devi, and it is one of the most famous cases that there's ever been about childhood memories of past lives. And so it's very well documented, and there's a lot on it. And we'll also have some links in the show notes to the resources that we used, for all this stuff that we're talking about today. But I want to shift over real quick to this Dr. Ian Stevenson. He founded the Division of Perceptual Studies in 1967, University of Virginia School of Medicine.
Yep, that's the one.
And this is just, when I read this, I was like, man, this is so cool. So he established the division in order to conduct research in which scientific methodology is utilized to empirically investigate phenomena which cannot be explained by the currently accepted scientific assumptions and theories about the nature of mind or consciousness and its relationship to matter. So amazing, first off.
Yeah, for sure.
Some of the stuff they studied, for example, and that he wanted to study further were various types of extrasensory perception, like
ESP.
Telepathy, apparitions and deathbed visions, after-death communications.
Wait a minute. No, I think this is another guy that I'm thinking of, but maybe he's not. One of these guys who, God bless them, these scientists or doctors or that kind of push the field of fringe development and anything kind of paranormal related. It's such a rarity these days and then. So it's pretty awesome to see. But I feel like it could be this guy, but he would do these tests where he would. There was a local hospital in the area, and he would go into, I don't know if it was the emergency room or the operating room, but he would write a word and put it on the top of a 10-foot up in the air filing cabinet. And his whole trick, but he wouldn't tell anybody. It would be after hours in the hospital. He would put it up there, and so that the typical thing is you have these out-of-body experiences, deathbed kind of confession kind of stuff, where they would pass away, and obviously they would kind of float out of body, they would kind of float up, but from that angle, they would be able to look down and see what the word was on the top of the, cabinet or whatever it was. And that was part of his studies, and it was just so overwhelming. And he did it for years and years and years and never really told anybody. But then, after he would find out that somebody had, an OBE.
Out-of-body experience.
Yeah, or NDE, near-death experience. He would contact these people and interview them, and 9 times out of 10, they would be able to say the word.
Weird.
Which is
I don't
wild.
know. I don't know. Do you know was that Dr. Ian Stevenson?
I'm not sure. He didn't come up in my research. I'm totally going from memory of.
It definitely sounds like something that either he or his division of perceptual studies would have investigated.
Right,
because,
right.
like you said, they did the after-death communications, poltergeists, experiences of persons who come close to death and survive. So NDE or near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences, and also children's memories of previous lives. The guy sounds like a Ghostbuster.
Yeah, exactly.
He sounds like Peter Venkman, and those guys. And, he had tons and tons of incredible essays and books that he wrote. But he actually, the tie-in here is he actually investigated the Shanti Devi case and interviewed her. And listen to this quote, man. He's quoted as, when referring to this case, he says, "I also interviewed Shanti Devi, her father, and other prominent witnesses, including Kedarnath, the husband claimed in her previous life. My research indicates that she made at least 24 statements of her memories that matched verified facts."
One thing that is pretty good about this case, I would say, is that it was so well documented. Because one of the things, if you do kind of start researching into, the case for reincarnation, one of the commonalities of that is, once they, almost always it's kids. And typically, as they start kind of getting into 6, 7, 8 years old, those memories completely fade away.
You're exactly right. That's actually one of the key elements about Shanti Devi's case that is so different and unique, in that most of the time, like you said, once a kid reaches, 8 or 9, that's it. They stop talking about it. They forget all of those past life memories. And in her case, she retained them. And even sort of remembered more.
Wow.
So super, super interesting. Again, met with very prominent people in the field of reincarnation and stuff. But
wow.
I mean, even more excitedly, I kind of want to, I guess you kind of found one that was interesting as well. And then I want to dive into what we think about reincarnation, some of our theories, what other theories exist about it. What do we think about past life regressions, all that stuff.
Yeah, so...
After these messages, we'll be right back.
Are you troubled by strange noises in the middle of the night?
Do you experience feelings of dread in your basement or attic?
Have you or any of your family ever seen a spook, specter, or ghost?
If the answer is yes, then don't wait another minute. Pick up your phone and call the professionals. Go, Ghostbusters.
We're ready to believe you.
America's future can be determined by our dreams and our visions.
It was very intense, bright light.
For over 200 years, there have been reports of giant man-like creatures.
From another dimension, another world, I don't know.
The most intriguing mystery on the North American continent.
Hey, this is Bryce Johnson from the Bigfoot Collectors Club, and you're listening to Tyler and Woody on That Would Be Rad, because that is rad.
So reincarnation, or it's also called metempsychosis, is basically what a lot of people would call the transmigration of souls. A lot of Asian religions, such as Buddhism, and like we were just talking about Hinduism, they all believe basically that a soul is reborn into mortal bodies. Now, Hinduism is different because I think it's sort of a karmic debt kind of thing, and you can basically be reincarnated as animals. It's not just a physical human body. Whereas I think in like the more sort of Eastern Asian religions, such as Buddhism, they only believe that it can kind of fall into, it has to be a human, basically. I didn't realize this, but it appeared at the end of the Archaic period, the philosophy of reincarnation, in the 6th century BC, a long time ago. And I guess it became sort of prominent in Greece, and from there kind of spread out. One thing that's really interesting is the term reincarnation is just Latin for entering the flesh again.
Yeah, dude.
Which
I wrote that down.
Pretty
so
awesome.
Cool, man.
Yeah, it's really cool. Also, let me say this. We don't really get into our faith much on the show because in this day and age, it can be divisive. And, I still don't necessarily think that, like, we have to get into it. But let me say this. I believe in a lot of things. I am definitely probably the quote-unquote true believer of the show. You give me any sort of fringe topic or, cryptid or paranormal, whatever. I typically try to find things that kind of anchor it into how I can believe in it. However, with belief systems that don't totally sort of line up with reincarnation, I've got to say, while it is a topic that is pretty much 100% impossible to ever prove, physically in like a lab setting, scientific method involved and all that. I mean, you cannot look, I don't care if it goes against every fiber in your being of not lining up with your religious beliefs. You cannot deny that the evidence is kind of mind-blowing, especially with it being 9 times out of 10, small children. And maybe it's because I have kids of my own. Woody has kids of his own. But like when you become like a parent, knowing, at age so and so, this kid was saying this, it's like it kind of, it's even more impactful if you have your kids of your own, because it's sort of like, well, there's no way. Like my kid's not even talking about, not even close to saying specific names and vehicles and like, so
Well, a couple things real quick before you continue. There's three things that I want to address from what you just said. Number one, I think that hopefully with this podcast, now, of course, this doesn't really fit into like our bullet points of our podcast here, but I think that one of the things that we hope for as hosts of this podcast is to kind of broaden a lot of horizons. And I think that it's important to remember that just because something doesn't necessarily fit into, even as sensitive as it may be, like a religious, I just invented a word, religious background or belief, doesn't mean that thinking about it should really kind of, and I know this is not what you were saying, but you shouldn't threaten that in any way.
No,
in
not
fact,
at all.
To me, it either strengthens it, or anytime it causes, to me, this is just something that I've believed since I was little. Anytime something causes you to question, to research more, or to read more, and to study more into whatever it is that you believe in, I think that is, that's what it's all about. Man.
yeah, fully. Yeah.
Second, there is kind of a scientific way that Dr. Ian Stevenson kind of developed to sort of not necessarily prove, because you're right. And on that same fact, boy, as far as religion's concerned, there's really no, there's not a scientific method in place to prove like the things people feel in terms of faith, right?
Right.
That's
Which,
immeasurable.
Just the definition of faith itself is the unquantifiable.
Right.
It's about, having faith, believing in something.
Exactly. But he did develop this really cool thing. I could literally explain it here. It's pretty in-depth, but it's called the combination lock test for survival. I'll actually put it in the artifacts too, because I found the book that it was published in, and it just a real quick summary of it is the reason why he developed this test was because, and I'll just read like, if you don't mind, a quick introduction by Dr. Ian Stevenson. In his introduction for this like test, it's like he wrote this medical article, and it says, much evidence which points toward survival of personality after death, especially that from mediumistic communications, falls under the criticism that the information communicated was either known to some living person or available in a documented form. I'm going to break in real quick. So, in other words, you watch these like shows, and I'm going to make an admission here. I've constantly been a very hard critic of mediums. Now, listener,
Same.
If that makes you angry, I'm sorry, but I will say every now and then I'll see like some TV show where I'm like, holy moly,
Yeah.
that's kind of crazy, but again, it goes back into this argument that I always think of like somebody
Charlatans.
living or some kind of document, especially with the internet now. And I'm thinking specifically of this kid. He's like the celebrity one. He interviews celebrities.
I know who you're talking about, yeah.
I've watched some
he
of
did
those.
like
and I'm
Kardashians.
whoa,
Yeah.
But I always think like, man, with the internet, you can find so much of this information. So that's typically where my mind goes, okay?
Yeah.
Well, with this test, this is what he was trying to kind of either disprove or prove. It's just a scientific sort of way to kind of figure out what's going on here. So he says that in either case, the medium, so this criticism suggests, might have obtained the information either through telepathy with the living or by clairvoyant reading of documents, right? And so, fast forward many, many years later, that would be, in modern terms, the internet.
Well, and I've never really thought about this, but it is kind of interesting, the gray area that kind of could separate somebody that sort of claims to be a medium and then the more sort of scientific leanings of like remote viewing. I mean, what if they're kind of the same thing?
Yeah, right.
You know?
That's what and that's kind of what he's saying. He's like, okay, look, if you're saying that the criticism is that for a medium to know these things while the person's alive, it's either from information that they obtained, whether they actually read something or they got that information via telepathy. And so he's trying to see, because also the same criticism is true for the case of like reincarnation. People will say, well, maybe this person knew that because they were somewhat sensitive to that kind of quote unquote vibration, and they got that information because, they're essentially like a medium. Okay.
Well, and let's sort of clarify also, a medium is basically you're speaking or communing with spirits of like people that have lived or like past people that have lived, that are dead, and you're speaking to those spirits. One thing that I do got to say that is also a possibility is there's also a thing that is referred to as the Akashic record. And a lot of people, celebrities, artists, creators through the years have made kind of claims. I mean, even Keith Richards with Satisfaction, he claimed that he's like, he said throughout his whole career, he's like, I don't do anything. He's like, I'm just the antenna, and I happen to be there at the right time with my antennas raised, and I pick up on whatever is being given to me, and I just like regurgitate it. I spit it back out. And so this idea that there's this sort of big record of like all the world's information, and it's able to be tapped into by anybody if they're able to kind of
if they have that like
tune into it. Yeah.
Well, it's funny. Paul McCartney said the same thing about the song Yesterday, and you and I both as songwriters can totally attest to what that feels like.
Yeah.
Like you can't explain it. You sit down, you pick up the guitar. You may have had a day or two where nothing, and then all of a sudden everything comes at once. Lyrics, melodies, the chord progressions, the structure of the song. It's just insane.
Yeah. Also, speaking of mediums, before we jump back into this, I do have a personal story that I'll tell real quick. I also I just don't know where I stand. I think there's a lot of charlatans, and even going back to like the spiritualist movement, it just feels like the Fox sisters and that whole thing. It just feels like you're pulling the wool over the eyes of, folks that maybe aren't as savvy or, clever. However, this happened maybe when I was 12 or 13. I was in Key West. My family and I would go for around 2 weeks every summer. There's a place in Key West called Mallory Square, and it's the furthermost point of Florida, of the United States, as far as like on the East Coast. And, if you jump off the pier and swim, you eventually hit Cuba. And so on this pier, it's super cool, and I used to be obsessed with it when I was a kid. There's people, there's like leather workers, there's like contortionists, there's like a guy that, sword swallowers, there's a guy blowing fire, there's like psychics and mediums. It's just like
frozen bananas.
But I ran across I ran across this lady that she kind of like, I can't remember, she asked me to like, come try it out or whatever.
Oh boy.
She said, hey, I with all my readings, I record the whole thing. I let you keep the tape. If at the end of this, and it's going to be on the record, it'll be on this tape. If by the end of it, the things that I say, if it's false in any way, if you don't feel like you received anything that was like accurate, then you get to keep the tape and I give you your money back. And I was like, okay, whatever. And I'm like a little asshole 12-year-old kid. So I'm thinking the whole time in my mind, like, this is going to be free and this is going to be awesome. And so the lady kind of goes through and she, says some like sort of character traits about me that could be hit or miss, or could kind of be like everybody, like, oh, you tend to procrastinate, you tend to, stuff like that could apply to anyone. However, the crazy part is it gets to the very end and she said, I'm still picking up that you're not really getting this, or that you're not really believing this.
Yeah.
And of course, I'm like the people pleaser personality. So I'm like, oh, no. I think it was great. It's like that whole sort of personality trait. She says, well, what if I told you something that would 100% make you believe?
I'm already pissed. Why didn't you? I'd say, yes, ma'am. That sounds great. Why didn't you lead off with that?
Well, yeah,
Go
exactly.
ahead. Keep going.
Well, so she goes, you carry Orion's belt on your chest. And she, as a 12-year-old, I can now look back and see that it was like pretty badass move. But at the time I was like 100% confused. I was like, what are you talking about? And she sat back and she just like, she didn't say a word and like was waiting on me to say something. And I was like, I don't know what that means. And she said, do you mind pulling your collar down of your shirt? No, like it's kind of crazy. I pulled down my collar and on my chest, I have like, freckles or moles or whatever that's literally in the exact shape of Orion's belt. And I had a black t-shirt, crew neck. There is no possible way that she could have remotely had that information.
Unless she saw you any of the years before on the beach.
Yeah, no, but anytime, like that was the thing too, is like anytime we would go to Key West, it was never a place because it was 40 minutes away from our like condo or like being at the pool and the beach. So there was never a time that I would just be like in a tank top there or not wearing a shirt. It was like, I'm going to kind of like dress up in my favorite t-shirt and Airwalks.
I mean, I can't even imagine you with like any color on, like, you're like.
I actually tan pretty well. The problem is I never go outside. But how weird is that? Like,
no, that is.
She knew exactly.
And can I say something too? Like, here's the thing. Like, I have always been an unfair critic of this kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Simultaneously, it kind of creeps me out. And so I've never gone in and had my fortune read or, like any of that stuff has always kind of like, just because there's a couple reasons. One, I'm like kind of scared that like they would know and they're going to tell me something that's just like, you're dying tomorrow.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. That kind of stuff or something like, I don't know. So I've always kind of like veered away from that.
Mm-hmm.
But, and I was thinking as you were telling the story and stuff and in the interest of us just kind of getting to the meat of what we think about all this.
Right.
I don't really want to explain this guy's like test. You should look it up though, listener, the combination lock test for survival. It's super cool. And essentially he developed this test so that people while they're alive can come up with a random combination for a lock and then send that lock to people that say, I'm clairvoyant, I'm a medium. And basically he's not necessarily trying to disprove that they are what they say they are. He's essentially trying to prove that people that claim to have these memories of past lives couldn't have gotten it via this clairvoyancy or this being a medium, like any kind of telepathy and that kind of thing. Or, he's kind of doing both, right? He's trying to like say, well, if that's true, then this will work and that's kind of cool. Or these people really did have these past lives.
Yeah, I think that's pretty fascinating. One thing that I always kind of go to, and it's the same thing with like, I think you and I can agree on this, as like into this stuff as we are, like Ouija boards.
Never done it.
Automatic writing, scrying, psychomantism or whatever it's called. Like all those things to me are like on the level with like Bloody Mary. And it's just like you're just really like tempting, something. It's like the famous quote where it's like you stare into the abyss long enough, the abyss begins to stare back. And it's like...
It's kind of like, dude, we learned our lesson
Yeah.
in all of the Ghostbusters movies.
Yeah, exactly.
1 or 2. You start messing with that kind of power, you're going to open up a portal and you're not going to be able to control it, right?
Yeah.
That's always been my fear.
Yeah,
Maybe
exactly.
it was because of watching those movies so much when I was a kid. But it's like, I got no interest. Hey, man, there's enough crazy stuff in this life.
Yeah.
I don't really want to go opening up doors to places that I don't know much about.
Yeah. Well, like my wife, Courtney, she's anything that comes up with us, it's like immediately it's like demons. And while I disagree, while I don't totally agree with that, I think there is room for like gray area and stuff. I do believe though that more times probably than not, like these like mediums and like if you're talking to a spirit in like a Ouija board or whatever, even if it's not like a demon, say it's like a lower vibration spirit or whatever, i.e. demon, but it's like how, like, what makes you think that whatever this thing is that is being very sort of clever and like vague and like tricksterish, like why would this person be like telling the truth? I think probably oftentimes, almost probably all the time, it's something claiming to be somebody or something else.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you this, since you are kind of coming at it in that direction. Do you think that every single thing is nefarious? I mean, in other words,
you mean with like mediums and stuff?
Well, I mean, just saying, like, if there is any sort of, let's just for this sake of this argument, that things that have passed on can somehow communicate. I don't know how long that window's open or whatever. Are you like? Do you think it's always
no
bad? I mean, it's always got to be a demon. What about the Widow Webb? Because here's the thing I just thought about. You know, Widow Webb from our Halloween Spooktacular episode.
Yep.
You know, it would have been scary as heck. It would have seemed evil. All she was trying to do was kind of like get her affairs in order before she, you know, got the golden ticket to keep on going. You know, so I think just like in life, there's good people and there's evil people.
Yeah. Well, and even like we got to do a show about it, but there's like a famous like Italian priest. You know what I'm talking about? This guy?
Yeah, are you talking about the one that like recorded?
Yeah, the radio thing.
Dude.
It's amazing.
Hold on. It's in my notes somewhere.
Yeah.
Yes.
We'll get into, we'll do an episode on it. It's this fascinating thing. And I mean, I think it's like from like the 50s or 60s.
Something crazy, man. He had this like old radio that would pick up voices, man.
Yeah.
And he even unplugged that sucker, man.
Exactly.
Because people, you know, like, well, maybe he's picking up a random radio signal.
Nope.
Yeah.
No, I don't believe at all that they're all nefarious. But I do think that people that are like, and I do need to make a clear distinction here too. I think there's people that are like sensitive. Like, I mean, as silly as it sounds, I feel like I probably fall into that. Like
you're the guy that talks about the X-Men and thinks that he's like,
no, I'm not saying that. But I have seen and felt a lot of things like throughout my life or whatever.
Yeah.
And so I feel like I probably am sensitive in some respect. And I think that's totally fine. And I think
let me make a little asterisk here and say more sensitive, because I do believe that like whatever it is, whether it's the veil is thinner or it's, you know, our reality kind of crossing over to a multiverse situation. I think we've all had that moment where we feel like some people call it coincidence, some people call it synchronicity, some people think or believe that it's a divine intervention. There are those moments in our lives where we're faced with some sort of decision and we kind of feel like we're sort of nudged in a direction.
Oh, yeah.
That either help us, save us, or whatever, right? So I just wanted to make that distinction, that you being more sensitive to other stuff than just sort of the norm. Because I think we all have a little bit of that.
Yeah. Well, and I don't necessarily think that like, oh, I've encountered this, so I'm like special. I think maybe because I am a little more open to certain things happening, maybe I happen to like
notice it.
Yeah, or notice it. Yeah, exactly.
If you don't believe in miracles, you'll never see them.
You're never going to see it.
If you do believe in miracles, that's when you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Okay. But what I'm saying is I think there's a big distinction in someone like me or someone like that who has these things happen, has had like these strange occurrences of the paranormal that they just cannot explain. And I think that's fine. And I think, you know, there's a possibility that they're communing with people that have passed on or whatever. We won't know until we die. However, I think the people that claim to be mediums, that claim to be, you know, like psychics, and I'm not talking about like sort of the more psychic side of like telepathy and like extrasensory perception and all. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the sort of classic like mediums and palm readers and yada yada yada. The people that really do claim to speak to, oh, I'm getting a vision of like your aunt, starts with an M, ends with a, either they're total charlatans or there's a strong possibility that they are getting information from somewhere. But I think that the possibility is pretty strong that it could be coming from like a nefarious place. You know what I mean?
I mean, no matter which way you slice it, it's extremely interesting and thought-provoking. You know?
And boy, we
dude,
derailed off of the reincarnation.
I know, man. And I wanted you to kind of talk about yours, but dude, I got to say, I really want to hear your ideas, and I want to express mine too about reincarnation, past lives, and stuff. Because as I was looking at it, you know, obviously there's different sort of belief systems in the Hindu religion and the Buddhist religion, and those two, I would say, in the major sort of theologies that exist, are really the ones that embrace this idea the most.
Sure, yeah.
But there's also this kind of like the two sort of like theories that I kind of read that sort of really piqued my interest. One is called the 13 lives theories.
It's like a cat with 9 lives kind of thing?
Well, no, it's sort of like, according to this theory, it states that our souls pass through essentially 13 stages or lifetimes to complete one cycle of enlightenment. So it's more like leaning towards like the Buddhist kind of thought on it. And depending where you are in the 13 lives can determine sort of the various roles you need to learn from at this stage in your spiritual development and stuff like that. I like that idea. And then another one that I read is that there's this kind of psychologist who, I mean, some of these academics, man, just think about, they just kind of have the luxury of being able to like sit around and just like think, you know? I just think that's so cool. But anyway,
cool, yeah.
He wanted to kind of look at it differently. And instead of thinking about it as a past life, think of it as an alternative life. And if you think of time as, like we've talked about before on the show, more like non-linear, that all of these lives are essentially occurring simultaneously.
Right, exactly.
And so you're having these almost invasions of thought in your dreams, in your memories, that are really just occurring from an alternate life that is happening at the same time.
Or dimension or timeline,
Exactly.
retro-causally, technically, I guess.
To me, I kind of like a blend of all of them.
Yeah.
Because it's just, I think mentally it's easier for me to grasp if they're not happening at the same time. And, I kind of like the idea of, and again, I'm not necessarily saying I believe this. I'm just saying I like the idea that in this life, we're given the opportunity to learn from mistakes. We all make them. We've all made mistakes in our lives. We've all done really good in our lives. You get this opportunity, however long or short it is, to do something like that, right? I like the idea of that not being the final end, right? That there is something else that potentially we don't understand. We've been given the information that we've been given because that's all we needed to be given to kind of live this section of whatever it is that comes before and after, right? I just kind of like dig that idea. Now, you told me something yesterday that I said, stop right there. Tell me on the podcast, because I want you to dive into what you were talking about like the sort of intersection of lives and stuff. There's something like, remember? You were talking about how like...
I was so drunk then, by the way. I'm just kidding.
You were talking about how like, well, just as an example, the example that you used was, thinking about the numerous amount of coincidences, choices, decisions that were made in both of our lives individually that led up to the fact that we met each other, became best friends, wrote songs.
Yeah.
That was the example you used. Go ahead.
Yeah, so if you do believe in reincarnation, there's sort of a belief, and there's several sort of terms that I kind of knew about, but I didn't really know. And again, some of this sort of starts to lean a little into like new agey stuff, which, whatever, that's fine. But some of it sounds a little like, okay. However, I do think there is something maybe to it. So, we've all heard the term like soulmates. Typically that's looked at as like a more sort of like romantic type thing. You have your one person, you'll find your soulmate. I kind of maybe believe that.
Yeah.
Maybe, yeah.
No. I definitely do.
Yeah. Well,
Now, are we telling what?
No.
I
I'm
just
not
gotta
saying
clarify here.
I'm not saying
Are you my soulmate, bro?
I'm not. Sorry, that was a
that segued into
weird.
It was just different.
Yeah. And so with that, there's the belief of like soulmates, which I do believe. There's this term called twin flames, and it's basically the idea that like when a soul is created, it's actually two souls, and so say you and I were twin flames, where you're optimistic, I'm pessimistic, where you get hot, I get cold, where it's like this sort of yin and yang thing that kind of also ties into like the soulmate ideas. Mm-hmm. One of the things that's really interesting is this idea of like soul families or soul pairings, where, and again, I don't know how much of this lines up with like sort of my belief system or what I believe, but it is really sort of interesting just to sort of ponder and think about. But it's this idea that we sort of travel in this like pack of souls. So say in this life, Woody and I are best friends. We do podcasts. We do this. We live the rest of our days as best friends. We both die. Boom, we're brought back onto the planet. Say
soulmates.
Yeah. On this time around, I'm a female who's from London.
Oh boy. Dude, things got real.
No. Just hear me out. Just hear me out.
Okay.
I'm a female from London. Woody's like whoever, a male around the globe. Somehow we meet at an airport, like hit it off. Da-da-da-da. Now we're husband and wife. We live the rest of our days. Man. Then we die. Then say Woody comes back as a woman who gets pregnant and has a little baby girl. Well, that little baby girl is now me. It's
okay,
like
I
this
see what you're
weird,
saying. It's just like this. Okay,
you're kind of like it's able to. It's not always the concept
the
of
same
like romantic or
yeah. It's also not the same. You're not going to live in the same It's not the same capacity
right.
the next time.
Yeah.
Okay.
But the idea is that
on the weirder side for me. But go ahead.
No, the idea is that you're always like
married to your daughter husband.
No, you're always together, and so
yeah. I mean, I thought you were going to go in a different direction. Like, no matter what, bro,
you're going to be my wife next time.
Jeez, I didn't expect that. But dude, this is part of the reason why I wanted you to like stop whenever you were telling. You didn't get here. I kind of wish I would have made you explain it so I could kind of like curtail some of that. But like, what's crazy is, so Ann and I had this like date night the other night. We went to this like wine tasting place. Maybe had a little too much wine. But we started getting to this like really interesting conversation. And we started talking about like, I don't know. If reincarnation exists, something that I do believe in some way, just, I mean, for lack of a better reason than just like, it just makes my heart feel good, is that like there would be this gravitational force.
Yeah.
For her and I to find each other again, no matter what lifetime.
Yeah.
Because like even those circumstances are even more like just insane that her and I even crossed paths in our life. And that was it for me, dude. So it's like, I don't know. It's because I'm, an emotional Italian guy. I love that idea.
Yeah. It is pretty fascinating. I mean, this idea that we're sort of, I don't know, there's a level of like, and again, I don't know how this plays into my belief system, but I do think there is something kind of like comforting, I would think, for like folks of like all these souls kind of sort of traveling through time in like a little pack, like a little family. Do we have time to get into
We're gonna.
My person?
Well, yeah, we can go into your person, but I wanted to just talk real quick about like this concept here. Because I think, again, it's important for us to address the fact that I think that just because we're talking about a concept like this, if it is, and I'm really speaking to the listener here, if it challenges your belief system, think of it as a concept. It's just conversation, right? And so like, to me though, I mean, dude, should I dive into like, like the...
Not yet.
Okay.
So I'll be quick about this, but my story kind of revolves around probably, I would say, of the modern age, another account of a possible case of reincarnation that is probably the most well-known of like our times, now. Let's go back to 2005, and there is a small child named James Leininger. He's 2 years old. He has been having these nightmares where he would scream out in the night like he was being hurt. He would kick his legs into the air when his parents would, run to his room and see what was going on. He would be screaming in his dream, plane on fire, little man can't get out.
What?
Yeah. So later, after this happened, by the way, this also started happening 4 to 5 times a week. It was like a consistent thing every single time. So finally the mom, as parents, we kind of say our kid has like a night terror or like whatever. Obviously Woody and I, our minds go to the deepest, darkest paranormal stuff ever. But regardless, as a parent, you're going to be like, oh, it's just, you ate something weird before
Shouldn't have
bed.
bought that Dybbuk box.
But, you kind of brush it off. But it was happening so consistently that the mom, in the daytime when he was awake, and again, he's like 2 years old, she says, what was happening? And he says, plane on fire. And she says, well, like, what does that mean? And he just says, little man can't get out. And she said, well,
God, dude.
Can you show me what that is? And which this is an odd part too. Usually we have these dreams and then they're just totally separate from waking reality. He laid on his back. He put his feet up into the air.
Oh boy.
So this is something that's like on the front of the mind of this kid when he's sleeping, when he's awake. He knew exactly what was going on. And she said, well, what little man? Who's on fire? And he said, me, Mama.
Hey.
Also, this small kid, James Leininger, was fascinated with airplanes and planes, like older planes. At the age of 2, he was taken to the Kavanaugh Flight Museum, where all the other kids are just kind of like, playing around or whatever. His dad said that he immediately slipped into this like mode. Keep in mind, 2 years old. You know what that's like. I know what that's like. He didn't just like walk around. He started walking around like almost like he was like inspecting the plane, like looking underneath it, like touching,
Like doing the checklist, basically.
Yeah. Well,
Pre-flight
that's a
checklist.
little bit later, but yes, he was like making sure all the rivets were in the right places. And then they were like, well, where did he go? And he had climbed into the cockpit by himself. He had, on the dash, he had grabbed the headphones, put them on, and then they said, by that time, they saw him through the window. And there's like a video of this. There's actually a documentary, which I have not seen. I don't know if it's any good, but I actually think it's on Netflix. It's called maybe Soul Survivor or something. His parents wrote a book about it years later. But by the time the parents come around to see him in the cockpit, he's moving levers, and he's like, he's 2, so a lot of his speech is a little sort of hard to translate, I guess. But he's like just going through this whole like pre-flight checklist, which again, 2 years old.
Yeah.
Basically, it kind of kept going on. Later, they kept finding out that he just would not stop. All of his drawings would be planes, dropping bombs, crashing, this kind of thing. It was kind of like who he was as a kid. So finally, one day, his dad says, why did your plane crash? And he says, I was shot. And he said, who shot your plane? And he said he turned around and he looked at his dad like you're such an idiot. And he said, the Japanese, Dad. And he said, well, what kind of plane? He said, Dad, it was a Corsair. Keep in mind, this is 2 years old.
Man.
Like how anybody would know this. Okay, and also let's say like well, maybe he just saw something, like his dad had something on TV or whatever. The dad had no idea what any of the stuff is that he was talking about. So the dad started like looking and had found out he said, okay, he found out like what plane it was. It was the Corsair. Kind of had like a line of questioning had brought him to the point of being like, okay, well, like where did your plane take off of? And he said, a boat. And he said, do you remember the name of your boat? And he said, the Natoma. And so the dad started, looking more into this and being like, well, maybe there's got to be something, And so the dad found a guy named Leo Pike that served on the Natoma Bay warship. And he's actually the guy that holds and organizes the Natoma Bay reunion in I think it's in Ohio, this small Ohio town, but it's almost like a, high school reunion or family reunion, but it's from people in World War II that, were part of that ship, the Natoma Bay. Yeah. His dad contacts this Leo guy, and after a few questions realizes that all of these places and the battles were actual sort of real places. Man. He then finds out, which this is mind-blowing. Keep in mind, little James would always sleep with these like 3 G.I. Joes. They were like the foot long, the 12-inch ones, like the old school ones. He had 3 like army men, G.I. Joes. And he then finds out that all those army men he had given first and last names to, right? And so they're the ones that he sleeps with every single night. And it turns out that those first and last names were men that served on the ship.
What?
They were all killed in action. And James said that once he was asked about this, James said that they met him in heaven after he crashed. Man. Yes, listen, it just gets even crazier, dude.
I feel like my story sucks, bro.
No. So you find out that Leo is invited, the Leo guy invites Leonardo DiCaprio invites James to his Natoma Bay reunion. Mm-hmm. At this point, James is 3 years old, and as soon as he shows up, he literally recognizes men and calls them out by their first and last names. Old men that are in the place without even being like, yeah. Come to find out that when he was little, they would say, what's your name? And he would always say James the Third, right? Mm-hmm. And they never really knew what the deal was. Well, when his dad was talking to this Leo guy who served on the ship, was also a pilot, I believe, come to find out that he's like basically the reincarnation of a man named James Houston, the James Houston Jr. He was a naval fighter pilot that fought in World War II, and on March the 3rd, 1945, as they were headed towards Iwo Jima, his plane took a direct hit, and at the age of 21 was declared missing and presumed dead. And so basically this is who he was, basically.
Now this is 2005. Well, I guess if he's 3, like now it's like 2008.
Yeah, he's like...
Do we have any follow-up? Do we have this, like, what's he...
Well, I think now there was a follow-up. I think like a blogger or something did a follow-up, and he doesn't... A lot of those memories have faded, like we had said. I mean, he still remembers the sort of, super kind of tragic crash, basically. So I guess what happened is he was hit, his plane went down, he didn't have time to eject with the parachute or whatever, and him and his co-pilot, crashed into the ocean. And then him, like when he was kicking in the air, was trying to kick the hatch open. That's what he was dreaming about.
Man.
But because the plane was hit, even though it was like underwater, I guess internally in the plane, it was like he was on fire, which is pretty tragic. But a couple crazy things, like even when he was in, when he was taken to that Kavanaugh Flight Museum, his mom, when you don't even know anything, you're like looking at your kids, you're like, there was like a, it looked like a bomb underneath the Corsair. And he says, look, there's a bomb. And he said, he turned to his mom and he said, that's not a bomb, that's a drop tank. And it's like little things like that. So he's at this Natoma Bay reunion. He's 3 years old by now. They introduced him to James Houston's sister, Anne. And he immediately said, it's not Anne, it's Annie. she wasn't my oldest sister. I had a sister that was older, and they said, well, what was her name? And he said, Ruth. And then he said, no, Ruth. And they look at Anne, this lady who's in her 80s at this point, and she says, yeah, that was my older sister.
Man alive, dude.
They kind of became friends. You know, they kept in contact. She was so sort of fascinated with this that she ended up mailing him some of James's last items, James Houston, the pilot, including a small little silver bust of George Washington. And his dad asked, well, where did you put this statue? And he said, it always stays on my desk. And they ended up later finding out that from his sister, they found out that when he was alive, like in his farmhouse in like the Midwest, when he was a kid, all through school, he had this little George Washington on his desk where he would study.
Man alive, dude.
It's fascinating.
See, this is what I'm talking about, man. It's just like this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
How do you explain that, man?
Yeah, and there's like, it is weird. There's also another thing that's fairly common in these kind of cases. I'm actually kind of surprised that it didn't show up anywhere in this one. Is a lot of times these kids that kind of claim reincarnation, basically, they'll have like a birthmark or like
some sort of similar,
some kind of like indicator, and like almost every single time, any sort of anomalous like birthmark or whatever, almost 9 times out of 10, whoever they're like supposedly reincarnated from, that's like where the guy was shot, or where they were stabbed in the back, or they fell and this happened. And so it's wild. It really does kind of go into this idea of, and I don't know where this sits with me, but I don't know. There's something about like the birthmark thing. It just feels like there's some kind of like repurposing going on or something. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
We talked about it a little bit before. I mean, it's a little bit like this idea of, and I mean, I guess you want to get into it now?
Man, I don't know. I think what you're talking about right now, sorry to keep it secret, listener, I think is, it deserves its own episode, man.
Yeah. Okay.
I think if there's anything that we learned here today, though, man, it's a couple things, but these bullet points kind of just popped in my head. Number one, if you're a parent, listen to your dang kid.
Yeah.
Although, my youngest would say just crazy stuff like, my mom went to jail yesterday. And we're like, whoops-a-daisies. Not where it's, they don't need to know that here at soccer. Real loud. Real loud. Everybody thinks my wife went to jail, which is hilarious.
Did they say something about your in-laws too?
I picked up my grandma at jail today. And we're like, well, that's not true. So,
yeah.
All right. Because then you're like forced, you feel this like need to like make sure you correct that so that people don't think you just have like a family full of like degenerates.
Yeah.
But anyway,
exactly.
Listen to your kids, pay attention to what they're saying, because they may have, can you just imagine? And then 2, I think we all kind of heard it, like Tyler really believes that he's my soulmate.
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
no, but I know what you're saying. Like, especially with that, like, I do feel like there are like, John Lennon, Paul McCartney. There's like, and just all these things that just coalesce in friendships, in creativity. All the people that we know. Gosh, our buddies over at Sozo Bear. All these things happen, and I don't know, man. I just feel like, but then see, now we're gonna make it. Then it's like, it's almost like, is it a railroad versus a sandbox D&D game? Are we just magnetically pulled no matter what the decisions are that we make? That makes it less interesting. I don't know. I think it's an interesting concept, dude, and maybe and I think this again is another separate episode, but I've always been fascinated with like dreams and how
this definitely feels like it's on the same, in that same world as dreams, for sure. But
and are we tapping into like another? I think I've mentioned this on the show before, but one of my buddies, and I wish I could ask him where he read this. I believe it was him that told me this, but unfortunately he passed away a couple years ago. but he talked about this book that he read
Let's
where
find a medium.
This concept of dreams being where your like soul or whatever you believe gets like once you go to sleep, it kind of travels to this plane of existence. You know, not heaven, not hell or whatever, but just this like area, we'll say,
the astral
where
plane.
you interact with other people that are also dreaming or whatever. And that's, you know, I think very simplistically, like part of the reason why you'll meet somebody in a dream that just seems so real, you know, and it's somebody that you've never seen before in your life. I promise you I'm not getting verklempt over here. I opened the Dybbuk box yesterday. No, but you know what I'm saying? Like all this kind of, in the melting pot of these kind of concepts, it sort of reminds me of that. And I think, like I said at the very top of the show, this topic has the potential to just be one that we could talk forever on because there's just so much to it. There's so many sort of like ways to think about it and different angles to approach it. It's just so fascinating.
Oh, yeah. And there's tons of cases. I mean, these two were probably some of the most notable. I mean, obviously. But I mean, they're kind of everywhere. I mean, even down to like stuff that seems pretty mundane. You know, somebody saying like, oh, well, my mom's name was Pam. You're not my mom. And da-da-da-da.
Yeah.
Then, you know, taking the kid to his hometown and then him. I mean, there's all these sort of crazy kind of things. But at the end of the day, it's like, well, I mean, you still can't, like, you know, prove
It's hard to explain that away, right?
Yeah, it's hard to explain away. But then it also, like, your debunkers are like, well, there's still no quantifiable evidence. You know, so it's like, you know, there's always going to be people, you know, on both sides of the coin.
And here, that would be rad. Our whole point is, boy, isn't it just fun to talk about and think about? Kind of, you know, stretch your mind a little bit and get outside of your comfort zone and, you know, on air, tell your best friend that he's your soul. I mean, just, you know, really just important stuff.
Just twin flames, you know.
Twin flames.
Islands
man.
in the stream.
Just journeying through life. And it's just like, you know, we're not going to let the wind sort of like blow us out. We're just two candles on different ends of the spectrum.
Two
One day it's going
sparrows
to
in
be
a
a
hurricane.
daughter, and then the next day it's going to be I mean, man, it got real weird.
Yeah. Well, it's been fascinating nonetheless. And we are definitely not experts in any way at all on this. And you can go nuts. And again, like we said, you could research this for days and just find case after case after case of these just wild accounts. But this is our take on it. This is what we thought was pretty fascinating. And I love it.
Yeah, me too. I mean, it served for no better reason than just to kind of like point us in that direction to talk about this, to read a little bit about it, and to kind of just think about it. You know, in between episodes, it's just been a really cool conversation, and I hope you guys enjoyed it.
Yeah.
If you know of any books and stuff that pertain to this topic, you know, we've got a lot of listeners that know way more about a lot of different things. If you're one of them, then man, feel free to, as most of them do, hop on our Instagram after this episode's released and in the comments, tell us about it. You know, book suggestions, things that we should read so that we can, you know, better educate ourselves on this specific topic or any that interests you.
Or if you have your own case of reincarnation and want to tell us about it, feel free to shoot a voice memo to thatwouldberadpod@gmail.com, or spooky stories or strange accounts or any and everything. We're all ears.
Yeah, and if you're not comfortable with like my wife isn't, if you don't want to record your own voice because you don't like the sound of it or whatever, feel free to write it down and we'll tell that story for you.
Oh, absolutely. So, like we always say, we couldn't do it without you. We're just super thankful for you guys. So, with that, we love you, we appreciate you, and as always,
be rad.
That's the way it goes. You're my favorite song on time where I just needed some sunshine. You were already dead, for you became a ghost. You are